Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome to part 2 of our video reviewing the game Star Wars Shatterpoint, the brand new miniatures game produced by Atomic Mass Games. Today we're going to be going over the gameplay aspect, how it flows, the general rules, all that good stuff, to help give you an idea if this is a game that you might want to give it a try or even invest into. And just as a gentle reminder that Level Up Games did generously provide me with their preview copy to assemble paint and managed to bang out a few games before returning it to them. So, of course, make sure to go hit them up if you like this game, if you want to try it out. They will be stocking the entire line of Shatterpoint models. Now, obviously, the Shatterpoint game does include a physical rulebook. However, Atomic Mass Games have already posted all the rules online. Here's the website. You can check it out if you want to, and read along with me if you want to check out some of these rules. Additionally, one thing I will say is the organization of the rulebook is incredibly good. It took me, on average, about maybe 30 seconds to figure something out if I had a question. The organization is quite good. There are lots of involved timing charts. Most of the time you don't need them, but it's nice to have them if you do have a conflict. So overall, I do want to give Atomic Mass Games props. The rulebook is exceptionally well organized, and even has a nice little quick reference on the back of it that makes referencing common rule stuff pretty easy. Now, what we're going to start with when reviewing the rules, we're going to start by looking at the missions. Now, as part of your list, you're going to be required to bring a mission set. Obviously, if you bring the core set only has one mission set, so both players will have the same one. But in theory, new missions will get added later, especially because it seems to be implied within the rules, although we haven't seen any. Now, the game is played on a 3-foot by 3-foot board, as we stated last time. The base mission card will tell you how you're going to set up the objectives, and then you have 9 different struggle cards, 3 of Phase 1, 3 of Phase 2, 3 of Phase 3. You randomly determine which of the Phase 1 and which of the Phase 2 and which Phase 3's cards. You have one of each. You keep them face down, they're hidden, until you actually start playing the game and get to the point where you reveal them. So this is kind of an interesting system because it means that each mission effectively has about 27 different permutations of how it could ultimately resolve, and that's not accounting for some of the missions having a built-in random element where the priority objective, the one that's worth more than the rest, can actually switch around between points. Notionally it's about 27. In reality it's probably not quite that much. It's not like the objectives are just going to rocket all the way across the table or something. Realistically they're going to stay within a pretty set range. However, this still provides enough variation that there isn't a set strategy to just run to a specific part of the board that will always be useful. So in theory, I actually kind of like that about the way the missions are currently laid out and the way they're handled. It'll be interesting to see what Atomic Mass Games does in the future in terms of releasing additional missions, how different they're going to be from the base mission, where they're going to release them, how often they're going to release them, etc., etc. But for the time being, we have the one mission. It plays pretty well for the most part. Now, alongside the missions, we have the main struggle counter. Struggle counter starts at 0 in the middle and goes out to the side at 8 at either end. Now, the way you set this up is you have the main counter in the middle at 0, that's the starting location, and then each player starts with one of their little black momentum cubes on the 8. And at the end of each activation, you're going to score up all the zones you have, and it's going to move towards your side, and your opponent at the end of their activation will score and move to their side. So when I say the game is back and forth, I mean actually literally, the scoreboard will quite literally move back and forth. There's also a bunch of ways you can gain momentum to make it easier to ultimately score, because obviously the goal is to get the score tracker to wherever you have the black cubes. So wounding an enemy character will add a momentum to you. If you move the tracker at the end of your activation and it's still on the enemy side, you will then gain a momentum, so it helps you catch up if you're behind a little, which is nice. Additionally, every time you move the tracker and it's in the middle, it's on the 0, both players gain momentum. So it's a cool little mechanic where if you're in a really close game, it gets progressively easier to leverage a small advantage for the win. So it's kind of designed to give a little bit of a catch-up mechanic, but also to ultimately break stalemates, which is a cool idea. Now, as far as how this interacts with the mission, you gain points on the struggle tracker or move it by contesting or controlling objectives. You control an objective if you have more characters contesting it than the other player. And the way it checks is it looks for first players that are not wounded within range 2 on the same elevation, and then it looks for characters that are not wounded within range 2 on different elevations. So it actually looks for the same elevation first, which is kind of cool. It's not really a big deal, but it's interesting. And of course, this will only work for whatever active objectives have been specified by the current struggle that you are on. So you're going to start on the first struggle. you're going to, go back and forth scoring points on the mission tracker, and then once one player achieves it, you reset. The mission tracker goes to 0, both players go to 8 momentum, and then you reveal phase 2 of the struggle. And now the player who lost phase 1 at that point gets to select which deployment map they're going to use on phase 2, which obviously gives them a bit of a handicap. Additionally, they're also going first because the other player scored at the end of their turn, so they get another handicap there. So it's a nice little mechanic where the second player isn't immediately kneecapped because they lost the first struggle. And of course, it's best 2 out of 3 struggles. So overall, I think the mission system is actually pretty good. It's pretty well rounded. I think it has a lot of potential. I am interested to see exactly where Atomic Mass Games end up going with this mission system, because obviously Crisis Protocol had some issues with the released crises, and they also ended up having to modify the Legion mission system because that also had issues with missions that were just way too easy for certain types of builds to score. So it'll be interesting to see what lessons they took away from that and how that will ultimately be applied to Shatterpoint. But we won't know that until much later on in the future, so we'll see what happens. So next up, we'll look at how you build your strike team, because obviously part of your strike team is going to be your mission stack, but then you're also going to have obviously your units. So a strike team always consists of 2 squads, and each squad will consist of a primary character, a secondary character, and a supporting character. Now, the primary character will have a certain number of squad points, and those squad points can be used to buy secondary and supporting characters. Obviously, they can't exceed the squad points of the primary character. So effectively, what you're going to end up with is a total of 6 units. You're going to end up with 2 squads of 3 characters. And the only real restriction is that for each squad, all members of that squad have to be part of the same era. So the eras are the Clone Wars, the Galactic Civil War, and the First Order. Just kidding. They haven't actually included the sequel trilogy in the game at this point. It's not even referenced in the rules alongside the Galactic Civil War and Clone Wars. Like, they could easily include it at any point. This probably just indicates that if those models are coming out, they're probably a while away, like at least a year, probably 2. So it wouldn't be that hard to include First Order or Resistance in the game, but it does look like they're not going to be the primary focus, at least coming out of the gate. Now, one other thing when you're building your squad is you are going to have to look at the force pool. Now, as of right now, the only characters that have force pools are primaries, and even if we look at this little blurb in the rulebook where it shows the supporting Ahsoka Tano and the primary Ahsoka Tano, or not the supporting, the secondary, like the secondary Ahsoka Tano and the primary Ahsoka Tano, the secondary, the Padawan Ahsoka, doesn't have any force. So this kind of indicates to me that we might not see a ton of secondary characters or supporting characters that have a force value at all. And the force is going to be, in this game, unlike in, say, X-Wing, force is not an asset for a single character. Force is an asset for your entire strike force. So both of your squad's force values combined will be the amount of force you have to spend. And you'll notice a lot of characters that don't have force value, even including supporting units, will have abilities that use force. So it's probably going to be heavily restricted as to who gets force outside of the primaries, but we'll see what happens. Now, one minor side note on a list building, the game distinguishes characters, which are a model, and units, which is the entire unit. Except the game is a little unusual when you start getting the 2 character units in, which are generally supporting units right now, like the 501st Clone Unit or like battle droids or whatever, because damage is applied to a unit. So the battle droids, for example, have like 9 health. If the battle droids as a unit take 9 health, they're wounded. It doesn't, you don't have to do 9 health to each battle droid. Clones as a unit have like 7 health. You don't have to do 7 damage to each clone, just to the unit of clones. However, there are still effects that specify character that will only affect one of them. For example, if we look at the damage charts, like some of the effects you can get, you'd be forgiven for just reading over this and seeing all of them as unit, and most of them do say unit. Well, you'll notice the shove effect, the one that allows you to move them, only says character. So if you hit a unit of clone troopers and you do 5 damage with a shove, the 5 damage will be applied to the unit as a whole. The shove will only be applied to the one person you hit. And I think this is going to be a point of confusion where a lot of people confuse the rules between unit and character. And I would definitely recommend reading that carefully, both when you're scanning through the rulebook and when you're looking at unit cards. Now, one last thing you're going to have when you have your strike team is you're going to have your unit order cards. Unit order cards, you're going to have one for each unit in your strike team, and then you're also going to have the Shatterpoint card. You're going to shuffle those together, and whenever you activate a model, you will pull the top card off of that deck, and you are now activating that unit. Except not really. There's a few ways you can kind of manipulate it. First off, if you draw a card and you decide you just don't want to activate that person right now, you can spend a force to immediately reserve that card. So you basically put it off to the side and then you draw a new card. And at any time, instead of drawing a card off the top of the order deck normally, you can use the card you have in reserve. Additionally, the Shatterpoint card, when you draw it, is effectively a wild. It can be used to activate literally any unit, even one that just activated. So you can also use the Shatterpoint card to try to augment that. Additionally, the Shatterpoint card, you can just spend a force to discard it and draw a new card. And the reason why you might want to do this is because you go through your deck, and then once you are out of cards, once you have nothing else to draw, you shuffle it back together, and then you also refresh all your force. So it'll get you back to cycling through your deck, and it will also get you your force back faster. So you might potentially want to spend a force to just ditch your Shatterpoint card, depending on where you're at in the turn sequence. And this is also one thing we do have to bring up. There isn't like a real turn sequence in Shatterpoint. You just keep alternating activations with the other person until you just run out of activations. And it's also kind of interesting because both sides start with the same number of activations. Both sides have six units on the table. And because it just keeps cycling, it doesn't even matter if units get knocked out, right? Like if you lose some chump units, now your powerhouse units are just activating more often because you're just cycling through your deck and getting your force back more often. So it does present a trade-off in that like simply trying to kill units to deny activations isn't necessarily the best strategy. You're more like your goal for attacking units is to try and wound them so that they can't contest objectives, or potentially wound them so you can gain momentum. You're not necessarily eliminating them because it gives you a major activation advantage, which makes this game kind of unique compared to a lot of other skirmish games. One thing I also want to point out with the order cards is there's a fun little detail in that if a unit has a start of activation trigger, it actually has this little yellow icon in the corner of the card that will let you know that it has a start of activation trigger when you draw it, which is a really fun detail and really shows that Atomic Mass Games put some effort into playtesting, and they saw that people were missing a lot of start of activation triggers, and they said, you know what, like it wouldn't be terrible if we shipped the game like this, but I think we can do something a little better. So it's a fun little detail. So one of the questions you might be asking is if there is no true turn sequence, like when do things like positive and negative effects fall off? Well, it turns out the only positive effect currently in the game is the hunger. The hunger effect gives you cover 1. It will apply either until somebody engages you in melee, which is to say they move within range 2 of you, or alternatively it will go away at the start of your turn. Additionally, if you were to scroll through the negative status effects, strained, disarm, exposed, and pinned, all of them essentially affect you once and then go away. For exposed, you can't use your defense expertise, and then once you're done defending from an attack, you lose the exposed condition. So all of the effects, all the negative effects in the game right now are essentially a fairly marginal penalty, and then they self-terminate, like they go away right away, which is a really cool system because it means you're not crippled for multiple turns. Like in Marvel Crisis Protocol, you can get so many negative status effects that like you're basically completely done until you get dazed. Like you're just hoping the enemy knocks you out so you can clear all of them. But yeah, like in this game, it does have, you know, effectively durations are based on like the activation, or they'll just go away when they come up once, which is a pretty good system. I really like it. I think more games should use systems like this. It's very reminiscent of Strain and Deplete in the game of X-Wing. So once you pull a character's order card, what do they get to do? Valid question. So now that character's activating, they get to take any 2 unique actions. And notice they must be unique, you can't take the same action twice. So a few of the basic actions, you have Take Cover, where everybody in the unit gets to push up to 1 and can take a Hunger token, which gives you cover 1, so this is ultimately a defensive action. Recover, every character in your unit heals for 1, which either removes the damage or removes the negative status effect, and this can also affect friendlies within 2 of that character, so you can use it to heal teammates. Then you have the Focus, which is during the next attack by each character in the unit. During this activation, you add 1 dice to the attack roll, and that's your only real way to natively modify dice. And then, of course, you can use any ability that specifies it's an action. And this is where we also get into where you're going to use force most of the time. A lot of abilities on a card It may say action, it may not say action, but generally speaking, a lot of the force abilities you can use at any time during your activation unless it specifies it's an action. And this is probably where you're going to use the most of your force. Now, even though you can't technically do the move action multiple times, a lot of characters do have additional ways to do movements outside of the move action. So say spin a force to do a jump or something like that. So just because you can only do a move action once doesn't mean you can only move once, if that makes sense. As far as the move action itself, there are actually 3 different types of moves you can do with a move action normally. You can either advance, which is using the big template. You can't advance if you're engaged by an enemy that's not wounded, and you also can't advance and end on higher elevation. You can end on lower elevation with an advance. You have the climb, where you can use the short template and you can end on higher elevations. You cannot climb while you're engaged by an enemy that's not wounded. And then you have dash, that uses the short template. You can only end on lower elevations, not higher elevations, but you can do it while you are engaged with an enemy. And these are just the basic actions available to anybody. One thing I do like about the system is that it doesn't get very complex in terms of moving through different elevations. Ultimately, if something's range 2 or higher above you, that is considered a higher elevation. You can go over it with a climb. It doesn't matter if it's barely 2 or if it's like up to the ceiling, who cares. Additionally, you can drop off of a 20-story building just by doing it advance, because the Star Wars universe, as we've established, has no fall damage. Like, I'm pretty sure more people have died of depression than gravity in the Star Wars universe, so it's pretty thematic that the game just pretends that it's not a thing. Now, there are other moves, such as jumps or whatever, but those are not available to you as part of the move action. You have to use like other special abilities to do those. So yeah, just be aware, those are not the only moves that technically exist in the game, but those are the only moves you can do as part of the move action. And the last action is going to be the attack action, where you just do violence to the other person. Now, this is actually kind of annoying to try and explain it, but it's very easy to walk through. So I'm going to walk you through an attack with Captain Rex shooting at a unit of battle droids, just to kind of show you the basics of how a combat sequence works. So we're going to have Captain Rex is taking a range attack. You can see on his card he has a range value of 5, so we're just assuming he's within range. He rolls 7 attack dice, so we're going to roll a 7 attack dice. And a 7 attack dice gets 3 hits, 1 crit, 2 masteries, and a failure. Now, the failure result, if you're used to Marvel Crisis Protocol, you might think it has some kind of special connotation where you can't modify it or whatever. Failure results in this game are basically just not successes. Like, they don't help you, but there's no special rules attached to them. They're more like blanks in X-Wing than they are failures in MCP. So the 2 mastery results, if we check his mastery card, we're going to see that 2 masteries give us 2 normal hits. So those 2 masteries are going to become 2 normal hits. Of course, the failure doesn't do anything, so our end result is going to be 5 normal hits and 1 critical for Rex targeting the battle droids. Now we can see the battle droids have a defense value of 4 against range attacks, so we're going to roll 4 blue dice for them. The battle droids get 1 block, 2 masteries, and a failure. Obviously the failure isn't going to do anything, and we consult their defense mastery chart, and we see that the defense mastery 2 only gives you 1 block. So this will only give the battle droids a total of 2 block results to cancel Rex's 5 hits and 1 crit. So those 2 blocks will cancel 2 normal hits. This will leave Rex with 4 total successes. So Rex can now use those successes to walk along his combat chart. So in this example, we're going to choose the top chart because that's the easiest. So the first result is 2 damage, the second result is 2 damage, the third result is an exposed token and 1 damage, and the last result is a shove and 1 damage. So this is going to do a total of 6 damage to the battle droid unit. It will put an exposed negative status effect on them, and it will also shove the one specific base of battle droids that Rex attacked. So that's essentially how you conduct an attack in the game. Honestly, once you start doing it, it's actually pretty straightforward. It's just with the masteries, the charts, all the special symbols, it looks way more confusing than it really is. The only other thing that I kind of want to touch on when you start talking about the combat system is the criticals. Criticals in this game are actually kind of weird because they can't be canceled by block results. Now, this doesn't come up as much as you'd think, because if you look at just some of the stats we have on screen, the battle droid and Rex, they're way better at attacking than they are defending, and this is pretty standard for a lot of characters in the game. And additionally, the attack dice are just weighted better than the defense dice. The defense dice are only about a third of the results are blocks, whereas the attack dice, about half of them are hits or crits. So occasionally it'll come up where you roll either a lot of criticals or a very low number of results in general where one's a crit, and in those cases it will matter, but generally speaking it's not as big of a deal. And characters like Jedi do have parts of their defense mastery where they can turn crits into normal hits to block them anyway, so it is kind of interesting. One big thing about this, though, is that the different combat charts for the primaries, the leaders, are actually double-sided. So you, at once during your activation, at any time during their activation, they can just flip it to the other side. And a lot of them have more offensive or defensive stances, or Darth Maul has like one side, he has like the ability to throw lightsabers, so he actually gains a ranged attack, which is kind of cool. But overall, like, it's an interesting system because it means 7 dice from Anakin Skywalker is completely different from 7 dice from a battle droid, even though the dice pools may look exactly the same. So it's kind of a cool system. It does kind of let itself down just in terms of it looks really cumbersome, like it looks really complicated, but once you start rolling it out, it actually goes by pretty fluidly. Now, I do have one minor qualm with the attack, and it's not actually with the attack sequence itself, it's actually with the card layout. One thing I noticed when I was playing is that characters like, say, Captain Rex and the 501st Clones, they both have white helmets, they both have blue markings. It's not super easy to tell at a glance what is what, and all you have, especially when all you have is a little like character icon, and the names are at the bottom in pretty small text. If they had moved the names up to the top in much bigger text, I actually think these cards would be a lot more legible. I think it does create a small amount of confusion to have the profile icon for the character be the primary way to identify it with the name and like small text on the bottom. But other than that, the system for combat, honestly, it's pretty fluid, it's pretty functional. I actually kind of like it. I think it's better than just the binary like hit or miss kind of systems, and it's also kind of better than just throwing piles of dice and like your better characters just throw more dice. Having your characters have completely different like damage tracks and all kinds of different like status effects. Like, for example, you can even see on Rex's card here, if you take the bottom route and you get 3 successes, you'll actually do 2 heals with it. So he can actually remove damage from himself or allies by attacking. You can also get jumps, shoves, other kinds of movement out of it, so you can potentially attack characters to kind of get your way onto point. So it's a really cool system once you get the hang of it. But this is where the game gets kind of interesting. What happens when the unit takes an amount of damage equal to its stamina? The stamina is the little like red number on the bottom right of the character card. When a character takes a number of damage equal to their stamina, what happens is they basically go into the wounded mode. They get a wounded token, they can no longer take any further damage, they can take negative status effects, they can use abilities. However, if the ability is reactive or active, they will have to spend an additional force to do it. And essentially at that point, the character is not contesting, they're not stopping stopping characters from leaving melee, all that good stuff. When the character activates next, the wounded token flips and the character is now injured. They remove all of their damage, they remove 1 negative status effect, and they can essentially activate normally from that point on. However, per injured token, you will have to spend an additional force to use active and reactive abilities. So the character can kind of just keep going, and they're no longer wounded, so they can contest objectives now, and they can hold people in melee now. And this is kind of an interesting system because it means that characters that are incapacitated in some way don't actually lose their activations. Like, they just lose the ability to affect the scenario for a turn or to keep the enemies in place for a turn, but they can still activate later, and they can still, you still get to get use out of them. Additionally, the injured token flips at the start of your turn, but you don't check to see if a character is defeated at the very end of their turn. So even a character that has a number of injury tokens equal to its durability stat, it will still get essentially one last kind of, I guess you could call it a zombie turn. Like, they will be removed from the table at the end of their activation, but they do get a turn to try and attack or try and achieve objectives before they finally get removed. And this is where the game really sells it for me, is a lot of games, especially skirmish games, tend to go into the route of trying to deny activations or trying to kill characters before they activate or last firsting or whatever. And this game kind of avoids it. Like, your characters still get to activate if they get knocked out. Even if they get killed, they still get to activate, one last time before they go down. Now you're still losing resources, and obviously the character still has to spend more force to do things because they have all these injured tokens on them, but you can still play the game with that character for at least one last turn. So I do actually really like the wounded and injured system in this game. I think it adds a layer that a lot of skirmish games kind of lack, in my opinion. And those are the basics of how you play a game of Shatterpoint. Overall, I have to say the core gameplay loop is actually pretty fun. I like the way the order card system works. The wounded and injured system, combined with the fact that you both have the same activations, and the way the order deck works, means it's more about positioning yourself well, about reacting to what order cards you're pulling, and reacting to the changing board state, rather than simply trying to beat activations out of the other player or running set strategies. Especially because the order card system means that you can't set up super ultra mega combos to wipe your opponent out, at least not consistently, because your opponent always gets a chance to interrupt you, and you can't even guarantee the same characters are activating in the same order every time. So overall, I think it's a pretty good system. I think it has a lot of longevity. I think it sidesteps a lot of the problems that a lot of skirmish games, even up to including Marvel Crisis Protocol, have had in terms of how they handle order of activations, how they handle objectives, stuff like that. And yeah, I think the game was just really fun. Everybody who tried it had a great time, and I had a great time too. I'm getting my own personal copy when it releases, which is unfortunately in 2 weeks, but you know, sometimes we just gotta wait for things. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you had a good time. Hope you learned something about Shatterpoint. And of course, if you do want to pre-order it, Level Up Games is probably your way to go. Additionally, if you want acrylic tokens, Curled Paw Creatives is generally the place I always go for acrylic tokens. Andrew Knuckles has gotten out tokens for X-Wing, Legion, basically all of the Star Wars games, so I'm confident he'll have them out for these too. Make sure to use the code RABBIT at checkout, because that will do literally nothing, but you know, it'll be interesting to see how many people try to use it. Anyway, he hasn't sponsored this in any way, I just really like the tokens. Hope you had a nice day, and if you want to see more Shatterpoint content, obviously this is not really my main type of content right now, but if I get enough positive feedback from this, I will definitely revisit that. So have a nice day, everybody.